I actually want to start this episode by talking about the pie I made last night.
Ooh, pie.
Pie?
So, on Friday, uh, I got home early, uh, and I had to make lunch. And my brother was home, and I was like, "What should I make for lunch?" And he's like, "You should make what your heart tells you to make." And so I'm like, "Well, my heart tells me I want to make a pecan pie, but I don't think I can." And he just goes, "Actually, we have all the ingredients for pie if you want to make a pecan pie." And I was like, "You know what? Bet." And thus I began my journey in making a pecan pie. So the first thing I had to do was make the crust, because you can't just have a crustless pecan pie. And it's a very simple recipe. You need flour, sugar, a little bit of water, emphasis on a little bit, and then and then butter. And that was it. You just needed just like 2.5 sticks of butter, a bunch of flour, a bunch of sugar, and a little bit of water. Well, I was mixing up my dough, and I see this freaking little tiddlywink of water, and I'm like, that's just too little. Obviously, I'm gonna need more. So I put in the water I have, and immediately I saw, I have a problem. Pie crust dough, when you make it, should not be sticky. It should be dry. It should be dry so that you can roll it out so it doesn't stick to your hands, so it doesn't stick to the pie tin. It should be wet enough that it sticks together and, doesn't have clumps. But it shouldn't be so wet that it just is goop. Because if you have goop, then that's what are you doing? So I was like, it's fine. I'll throw it in the fridge. I'll let it settle for a while, and it'll be great. So I threw it in the fridge for several hours. I was only supposed to let it set for 2, but that is besides the point. And I come back to it. I was like, all right, well, let's see how we can do it. And I take out this glob of really wet dough. There's clumps of butter. It was really bad. And I'm like, you know what? It's fine. We'll just make it. I just want to make a pecan pie, and it'll turn out. So I start trying to roll my my dough, and it's obviously not working because it's wet enough that it's sticking to my hand. So of course it's gonna stick to my rolling pin. And so I'm like, all right, it's fine. I have to persevere. And I'm like, okay, you have to add flour to wet dough. That way, it'll kind of soak up the moisture and it'll be all good. So I start just grabbing little pinches of flour and kneading it into the dough. And it was making it worse. The table was a mess. There was just globs of dough everywhere. There was flour everywhere. And I'm like, this is terrible. So I try to grab my dough and put it into like this bowl, but like a quarter of my dough stayed on the table. So I just grabbed a bunch of the wet dough and I grabbed the stuff off the table. I just threw it away. I'm like, okay, okay, it's fine. It's fine. Just gotta make the stupid dough, make the stupid pie. Okay, it's fine. So I just start adding in more flour, and every time I thought it was gonna be good. I start adding in this flour, and I'm like, it's perfect. It's so dry, nice and dry, and it's not sticking to my hand anymore. And then I would knead it, and then it get to this part where my hand would just go, just as wet as when I started. And I was like, oh, oh, not again. And I would add more flour and more flour and more flour until I'm looking at my bag of flour, which is utterly destroyed. It's all my brother's fault. And and so I'm just like, I dumped in the entire bag of flour, all that was left in that bag of flour. And then
Oh,
I took my ball of dough and I was like, this, I'm going to have to add water now. Like, this is going to be too dry. And as I'm kneading this dough, and then I'm like, okay, it looks like it's turning out fine. It'll be fine. And then I get to that part, it just goes, and I'm like, there's no way this dough is still wet. There's no way. I have added all the flour. I've thrown away half the dough. There is no shot that this thing is still wet. And I'm like, what do I do? I'm out of flour. And I remembered, oh, that's right. We have a bag of almond flour in the freezer. Yeah, I was just throwing flour on the problem. And then I grab this almond flour. I'm like, this is all I've
Oh
got.
no, Daniel,
And I
no.
just I grabbed a handful of almond flour and I just throw it in this dough and I start kneading it in it. Same problem, it's still wet. I'm like, there's no shot. And I keep going. And finally I get so fed up that I let out a of frustration. My dad comes up and he's like, what's wrong, man? You all good? And I was like, it's wet, father. Hearken to me, look at the dough, it is wet! The moisture prevails! And so finally I was like, okay, I gotta look this up on YouTube. I need to see what I have to do because this isn't working. And it's like, so if you have wet dough, you're gonna want to add flour. I'm like, bruh, I'm out of flour. What do I do? And then it was like, and after you've added the flour, let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. And I'm like, oh,
No!
of course. So I just take this bowl of dough and I just set it on my kitchen table. I'm like, I'm just gonna leave it. And so I went downstairs, watched an episode of Bad Batch, and I come back up to my mortal enemy. And at long last, it was perfect. There was no wetness. The clumps of butter had been eviscerated by my wrath. I was so angry at this dough, and I'm like, finally, it's over. And I'm like, start rolling it out. And it was the perfect size for my pie tin. That half of the dough that I'd thrown away would have just gotten in the way. And it just all came together perfectly, other than the fact that I needed a tablespoon of flour. But then I just used more almond flour, so it was fine. And finally the pie filling comes together, and I put it in the pie, and I throw it in the oven. And an hour later comes the most amazing pie of all time, and it is perfect. I don't know how, but through my absolute vengeful rage toward this stupid flour and the stupid dough, it it is genuinely the most amazing pecan pie I have ever eaten in my entire existence.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that it paid off.
All
Huh.
of
I
it was
genuinely thought this was gonna go a much more sad route of the pie is destroyed. You added way too much flour.
Like the pie has broken you to a point where it's like you can't put yourself back together again, but no, you overcame.
I did at long last.